I was just cleaning his mansion, that's all. But when he grabbed my wrist and stared at the necklace on my neck, his hands were shaking. He said only one word. Evelyn, I didn't know that name yet. But that necklace was about to unravel a secret my mother took to her grave. Before I tell you what happened next, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this story gets deeper than you think. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of powerful people, stay with me, this one's for you. My name is Odessa, and 2 years ago my life fell apart so quietly that nobody even noticed. One Friday I had a job at a warehouse folding boxes for minimum wage, and by Monday the whole place had shut down. No warning, no severance, just a locked door and a sign that said closed permanently. I had a 9-year-old son at home who needed shoes for school, and I had exactly $213 in my bank account. I remember sitting in my car in that empty parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned pale, trying not to let him see me cry when I picked him up later. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a single mother. You don't get days off from being strong, even when your whole world is crumbling underneath you. For 3 months, I applied everywhere: grocery stores, cleaning companies, fast food, anything. I got maybe 2 callbacks, and neither one turned into a job. I started skipping meals so my son wouldn't have to. I sold my mother's old dining table, the one she left me when she passed away the year before. That was the hardest sale of my life, but rent doesn't care about sentiment. The only thing I refused to sell, the only thing I held onto no matter how bad things got, was a small gold necklace that had belonged to her. It wasn't worth much money. A pawn shop probably would have given me $30–40 for it. But it was the last piece of my mother I had left, and every time I put it on, I felt like she was still with me, telling me to keep going. It was my neighbor, Miss Odeleys, who told me about the job. She worked part-time doing laundry for a wealthy family a few towns over, and she said their housekeeping agency was hiring for a live-in position at some big estate. She said the man who owned the house, a CEO named Gregory Hale, was known for treating his staff well. Fair pay, good hours, respectful. She said a lot of rich people talk about respect but don't practice it, but this man was different. His wife had passed away a couple years back, and ever since then the house had gotten quiet, almost like it was holding its breath. They needed someone reliable, someone who could keep the place running. I almost didn't apply. I kept thinking, a house that big, a man that powerful, he's not going to want someone like me walking through his halls. But desperation has a way of pushing you past your fears. I put on the only blazer I owned, practiced my handshake in the mirror, and drove out to that estate with my heart pounding the whole way there. The interview lasted maybe 10 minutes. I didn't even meet Gregory Hale himself, his estate manager handled it, a stern but fair woman who asked about my experience and my availability. 2 days later I got the call. I had the job. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone still in my hand, crying tears I didn't even know I'd been holding back for months. My son asked me what was wrong, and I told him, "Nothing's wrong, baby, everything is finally right." That first morning, driving up to the estate, I felt like I was entering a different world entirely. The gates alone were taller than my whole apartment building. The driveway wound through gardens so perfectly trimmed they looked painted on. And the house itself, it wasn't a house, it was something out of a magazine, stone and glass and silence. I remember thinking, people really live like this. Then I remember thinking, and people like me clean up after them. The staff were kind enough. There was an older man named Bennett who had worked there longer than anyone, a butler in the old-fashioned sense, always proper, always watching everything with careful eyes. He showed me around that first day, explained my duties, told me which rooms were off limits. When we passed a set of double doors near the east wing, he lowered his voice and said, "That's Mr. Hale's private study. Nobody goes in there, not since Mrs. Hale passed." I didn't ask questions, it wasn't my place. But I noticed how his voice changed when he said her name, like he was stepping carefully around a wound that hadn't healed. I didn't meet Gregory Hale properly until my third day. I was carrying linens down the main hallway when he came around the corner, moving fast, clearly headed somewhere important, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my car. I stepped aside quickly to let him pass, kept my eyes down the way you learn to do in these houses, not out of weakness but out of simple boundary keeping. But he didn't just pass by, he stopped, completely stopped right there in the middle of the hallway. I looked up, confused, wondering if I'd done something wrong, and that's when I realized he wasn't looking at my face at all. He was staring at my neck, at the small gold necklace resting against my collarbone, the one that had belonged to my mother. His face went through something I can only describe as a kind of quiet devastation. All the color seemed to drain out of it. His jaw tightened. And then, before I even understood what was happening, he reached out and gently, almost desperately, took hold of my wrist. Not rough. Not threatening, but firm, like a man holding onto something that might disappear if he let go. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper. I pulled my wrist back, my heart pounding, unsure whether I was in trouble or whether something worse was happening. "It was my mother's," I said carefully. "She passed away last year, it's all I have left of her, sir." He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something flicker behind his eyes, something between recognition and disbelief. Then, just as quickly as it had come, he seemed to catch himself. He straightened his jacket, cleared his throat, and said quietly, "I'm sorry. It just reminded me of something. Please carry on." And he walked away fast, almost like he was running from a ghost. I stood there in that hallway for a good minute, my hands trembling slightly, replaying what had just happened. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand why a stranger, a billionaire no less, would react that way to a simple gold necklace worth maybe $50 if that. But I told myself it wasn't my business. Rich people had their own troubles, their own ghosts. I had a job to keep and a son to feed. I put it out of my mind, or at least I tried to. But over the next few weeks, small things kept happening that I couldn't quite explain away. One afternoon, I was asked to help dust the portraits in the East Corridor, an area normally handled by another staff member who'd called in sick. And there, hanging near the top of the staircase, was a large oil painting of a woman. Beautiful, elegant, with warm brown skin and kind eyes that seemed to follow you across the room. And around her neck, painted in careful, deliberate detail, was a necklace that looked exactly like the one I wore every single day. I stood frozen in front of that painting for what felt like forever. My hands went cold. I told myself it was a coincidence, that lots of necklaces look similar, that gold pendants aren't exactly rare, but something deep in my gut told me this wasn't a coincidence at all. A few days after that, I was assigned to help Bennett organize some old files in a storage room adjacent to the forbidden study, files that had nothing to do with the study itself, just old household records. But the door to the study was cracked open that day. The first time I'd ever seen it that way, and through the gap I caught a glimpse of a desk covered in papers, and what looked like a private investigator's folder, thick and worn, with a name scrawled across the tab. I didn't get close enough to read it clearly, and I certainly wasn't going to go poking around uninvited, but the image stayed with me. A man grieving his wife doesn't usually keep private investigator files years after her passing, not unless he's still searching for something. I started asking careful, quiet questions, the way you do when you're trying not to seem nosy but you can't shake a feeling. One of the older housekeepers told me in hushed tones over folding laundry that Mrs. Evelyn Hale had been adopted as an infant, and that she'd spent years quietly, privately searching for her birth family before she passed. She said Mr. Hale had promised her before she died that he would keep looking, that he wouldn't let that search die with her. The housekeeper didn't know much more than that, only that it was a painful subject nobody was supposed to bring up. Evelyn. That was the name he'd whispered in the hallway that first day. It all started clicking together in my mind, but I still couldn't make sense of what it had to do with me, with my mother's necklace. I told myself it was probably nothing. Grief makes people see connections that aren't really there. I focused on my work, on my son, on simply being grateful for a steady paycheck after months of struggling. Then came the night of the gala. Mr. Hale hosted an annual charity event at the estate, a massive affair with business partners, socialites, and philanthropists filling every room of that enormous house. The entire staff had been preparing for nearly 2 weeks, polishing silver, arranging flowers, rehearsing service for hundreds of guests. I was assigned to serve drinks in the main ballroom, weaving through crowds of people in gowns and tuxedos, worth more than my annual salary, balancing trays of champagne, with a smile plastered carefully on my face, the way you learn to do in this line of work. Even when your feet are aching and your mind is somewhere else entirely. I remember that night clearly because I almost didn't wear the necklace. I'd taken it off earlier while getting dressed, worried it might slip and fall into a champagne glass, worried about losing it in a crowd that large, but something told me to put it back on. Some quiet voice in the back of my mind said, "Wear it tonight." So I did. I clasped it around my neck, tucked it just slightly beneath the collar of my uniform, and went downstairs to work. The ballroom was glittering, full of laughter and clinking glasses and soft orchestral music. I was moving through the crowd, offering drinks, keeping my head down the way you're trained to: professional, invisible, efficient. I remember reaching a small cluster of guests near the grand staircase, offering my tray, when I heard his voice nearby, deep in conversation with a group of businessmen. And then silence. I felt it before I understood it, that sudden shift in the air, like the whole room had inhaled at once. I looked up and saw Gregory Hale standing several feet away, completely still, his wine glass tilted dangerously in his hand, his eyes locked directly on my neck, on the necklace which had slipped just slightly free of my collar in the warmth and movement of the evening. The glass slipped from his fingers. It didn't shatter, someone caught it just in time, but the sound of it clattering against the marble floor was enough to turn every head in that ballroom toward us. I froze completely, tray still in my hands, unsure what I had done wrong, my heart slamming against my ribs. He walked toward me, slow and deliberate, ignoring the concerned murmurs of his guests, ignoring everything except me. When he reached me, he didn't grab my wrist this time. He simply stood there, staring at the necklace like a man staring at a ghost he thought he'd buried years ago. "Where?" he said, his voice shaking, loud enough now that the nearby guests could hear. "Did you get that necklace?" The whole room had gone quiet, dozens of eyes on us, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment and fear all at once. "Sir," I said carefully, "it was my mother's. I've told you before, it's the only thing I have left of her." He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, and I watched his composure crack completely, right there in front of his most important guests, this powerful, controlled man suddenly looking lost and broken. He turned to Bennett, who had appeared quietly nearby, and said in a voice barely holding together, "Take her to my study. Now, please." I remember walking through that crowd of stunned faces, my tray handed off to someone else, my legs shaking beneath me, wondering if I was about to lose the only job that had kept a roof over my son's head. Inside the study, finally alone with him, Gregory Hale sat down heavily behind his desk and pressed his hands against his face for a long moment before looking up at me. And then, quietly, he told me everything. He told me that his wife, Evelyn, had been given up for adoption as an infant, decades ago, during a time when her birth mother, a young woman struggling with poverty and no support, felt she had no other choice. Evelyn had spent her entire adult life searching for answers, hiring investigators, chasing dead ends, desperate to know where she came from, desperate to find any piece of the family she'd lost. Before she passed away from illness 2 years earlier, she had made her husband promise on her final days that he would never stop searching, that he would find the truth even after she was gone. He reached into a drawer and pulled out an old photograph, worn at the edges, and a folder of adoption records he'd spent years gathering. And there, listed as the birth mother, was a name I recognized instantly, because it was the same name written on my own birth certificate. My mother's name. I sat in that chair, completely numb, unable to process what I was hearing. My mother had never once mentioned another child, never once hinted that I had a sister somewhere in this world. I always believed I was her only daughter. That night I left the estate the moment I could and drove straight to my mother's old storage unit, where a small locked box had sat untouched since her passing, one I'd never had the courage or the reason to open. My hands trembled as I finally broke the old lock. Inside, I found a hospital bracelet with a name I didn't recognize, old adoption paperwork yellowed with age, and a letter written in my mother's handwriting, one she had clearly never found the strength to send. In it, she confessed everything. Years before I was born, during the hardest chapter of her life, alone and with no support, she had given birth to a daughter she could not keep. She wrote about the guilt that never left her, the prayers she said every single night hoping her daughter had found love somewhere in this world, the shame that kept her silent for decades, even from me. That daughter was Evelyn. I sat on the floor of that storage unit, surrounded by the pieces of a secret my mother carried silently to her grave, and I finally understood why Gregory Hale's hands had shaken the very first time he saw that necklace on my neck. Because in some strange, unbelievable twist of fate, the necklace Evelyn had worn her entire life, the one my mother had given her before giving her up, had somehow found its way back into our family, resting now around the neck of the sister she never knew she had. When I returned to the estate the next morning, unsure whether I'd even still have a job, Gregory was waiting for me on the front steps, something I'd never seen him do before. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at me, really looked at me, the way you look at someone once you finally understand who they are. And then he said quietly, "She would have loved you. I know she would have." He told me that Evelyn used to talk about wanting a big family, siblings, cousins, the kind of noisy, chaotic love she never got to experience growing up in the foster system before she was eventually adopted. He said finding me didn't bring her back, nothing ever could, but it felt like finally keeping the promise he made to her, the promise that had haunted him every single day since her passing. In the weeks that followed, everything changed quietly and without fanfare. I wasn't asked to leave my position, but I also wasn't treated as staff anymore. Gregory insisted on setting up a trust for my son's education, not as charity, he made that very clear, but as family looking out for family the same way Evelyn would have wanted. He showed me old photographs, letters Evelyn had written during her search, and I began to see the shape of a sister I never got the chance to meet, but who had spent her whole life hoping for exactly this. I think about my mother often now, about the weight she must have carried all those years, the secret she was too afraid or too ashamed to ever speak aloud. I used to be angry about it in the quiet moments when the grief crept back in, angry that she never told me, angry that I lost the chance to know my sister while she was still alive. But mostly now I just feel grateful. Grateful that even in her silence, my mother left behind a thread, one small golden thread, that eventually led me home to a piece of family I never knew I was missing. I think about how close I came to selling that necklace, back when things were at their worst, back when $30 or $40 felt like it might make the difference between eating and going hungry. And I think about how something so small, something the world would have looked at and called worthless, ended up being the very thing that changed my entire life. I used to feel invisible in rooms like that ballroom, carrying trays through crowds of people who looked right past me like I wasn't even there. But I've learned something since then, something I carry with me every single day now. Sometimes the people this world overlooks the most are carrying the very answers someone else has been desperately searching for. Sometimes the quietest, most unnoticed person in the room is holding a piece of someone else's missing story. You just never know whose life you might be connected to, whose broken pieces you might be the key to putting back together. If this story touched you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever discovered a truth about your family that changed everything? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that their story isn't over yet. I'll see you in the next one.